When I felt his fingers press into the tense muscles of my lower back, I knew I should have stopped him. I should have stood up, adjusted my sweater, laughed it off like an innocent favor, and gone back to my book. But I didn't. I closed my eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough for my body to remember what it felt like to be touched with care, not duty, not routine, not indifference. My husband hadn't touched me like that in years, and suddenly here I was, lying on a blanket in a trailer in the mountains, asking my grown stepson to rub the knots out of my spine. His hands were firm, cautious, respectful, but I felt every breath he took, every hesitation. And when his thumb brushed too close to my waistline, I didn't flinch. I didn't stop him. I let the silence stretch between us, longer than it should have. And I told myself it didn't mean anything. That it was just a massage. That I was just tired. That nothing had happened. But 3 weeks later, I still remember every second of that evening. And now, before I tell you what came after, before I unravel the decisions that changed my life and tore apart everything I thought I knew about myself, tell me in the comments, have you ever crossed a line you never meant to approach, only to realize you were already far past it? It started quietly. The kind of quiet that creeps up on you over years, so subtly that you don't notice until you're surrounded by it, until it fills your mornings, your dinners, your empty bed at night. My husband and I weren't unhappy, not in the dramatic way people imagine when they think of failing marriages. We didn't fight. We didn't scream. We simply existed beside each other, like two well-worn chairs in a living room no one visits anymore. He was practical. Reliable. Focused on things that could be fixed with a wrench or balanced in a spreadsheet. He never forgot anniversaries or birthdays, but he'd stopped asking how I slept. He'd tell me he loved me before hanging up a call, but never looked up from his tablet when I walked into the room. I told myself it was normal, that this was what long marriages became. Familiar. Predictable. Safe. And then, one evening, he handed me a folded map and said, "You should take the trailer for a few days. Get some fresh air. Stretch out your back. You've been saying how tight it feels." He said it like an errand, not a gesture. Like I was a houseplant that needed sunlight. "Take him with you," he added, meaning his son from a previous marriage. "He knows how to set up camp." I paused. "Are you not coming?" He shook his head. "Meetings. Too much going on at the office." The decision was made for me. 2 days later, we drove into the mountains, just the two of us, towing the old trailer behind his truck. The silence on the drive was comfortable at first. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man, older than I was when I met his father. We talked about music, traffic, gas prices. Nothing personal. Nothing that mattered. The first evening in the trailer, I noticed the sharp tug in my back as I reached for a shelf. I winced, tried to hide it, but he saw. "You okay?" he asked. "Just tight," I muttered. "Always gets like this after a long drive." He offered to help. I laughed it off. "I'm fine. It'll pass." But the trailer was small, and the hours long. Eventually, I laid down on the folded-out bench, wrapped in a blanket, trying to read, but the ache grew sharper. I shifted, trying to find relief. "You sure you don't want me to?" he asked again, standing awkwardly nearby, unsure. I should have said no. I should have turned on my side and pretended to sleep. But instead, I said, "Just for a minute. I won't tell your father you touched my spine." He smiled. It was awkward, boyish, even. He sat beside me, and I turned onto my stomach. I could feel the tension in his posture before he even placed his hands on me. His fingers pressed gently into my lower back, careful and methodical. He was more respectful than I expected, almost clinical. But I felt his breath shift when I exhaled. I felt the moment he became aware of the shape of my waist, the softness beneath the sweater. And still, I didn't stop him. I told myself it was nothing. That it wasn't real. That he was just helping. But something about the way his hand slowed as it neared my hip, not quite touching, not quite retreating, made my skin burn. He pulled away first. Stood up too fast. Mumbled something about making tea and disappeared into the kitchenette. I stayed still for a long time after he left, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint clink of cups. My body buzzed, not with excitement, not with desire, but with the ache of something long buried suddenly unearthed. That night, I lay awake in my bed, the trailer creaking softly in the wind. I kept replaying those few minutes, wondering why they felt louder than whole conversations I'd had with my husband in months. I told myself it was the mountain air. The fatigue. The isolation. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't just about my back. It was about being noticed. The next morning, we packed up and drove home without mentioning it. He didn't bring it up. Neither did I. The drive was quiet again, but not comfortable this time, heavy, like something fragile sat between us. When I walked back into our house and saw my husband standing in the kitchen, sipping coffee, I expected guilt to wash over me. But it didn't. What I felt was a kind of grief. For all the years I'd spent waiting to feel seen. For the version of myself I had slowly stopped believing in. He glanced at me. Good trip? I nodded. Restful. He didn't ask anything else. And just like that, we were back to our normal. But something had shifted. And I think, deep down, I knew it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. It had been a week since we returned from the mountains, but the moment lingered like the smell of wood smoke on fabric, subtle, clinging, impossible to wash out. I had resumed my routine. Morning coffee, silent breakfasts, the sound of the garage door closing as my husband left for work, the rhythmic hum of laundry tumbling in the machine. And yet, every mundane task felt like it vibrated with a hidden echo, his hands on my back, the breath I held, the breath he held, the exact second I didn't say stop. I didn't hear from him. No text, no call, not even one of those obligatory follow-ups his father might have expected. Did she make it home okay? But I found myself thinking about him more often than I should have. The silence between us in the trailer had been louder than words. And now, the silence after, louder still. That morning, I walked to the store to pick up groceries. I didn't need anything urgent, just wanted to stretch my legs, do something other than sit in a quiet house. The air was warmer than I expected. I wore a light jacket, but the sun on my skin felt like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I was scanning the shelf for a specific kind of tea my husband liked when I saw him. He was in the next aisle. Alone. Wearing a navy pullover I remembered folding months ago. My stomach fluttered in a way that made me angry at myself. I stood still. Watched him turn, hesitate, and then spot me. His expression didn't change dramatically, just a softening around the eyes. He lifted a hand, unsure. I nodded. He stepped over, holding a small carton of juice. Hey, he said, voice low, neutral. Hey, I returned. There was a pause. Not awkward, exactly. Just waited. You doing okay? He asked. Fine. He nodded. Back feel any better? The words struck a nerve, not because they were inappropriate, but because they were so innocent. He wasn't asking about my spine. We both knew that. And yet, the question hung in the air like something sacred we didn't want to drop. Yeah, I said. Much better. We stood in the cereal aisle like we'd never been anywhere but here, surrounded by cardboard boxes and fluorescent lights, talking like strangers who shared a secret neither of them had the language for. He gestured toward my basket. "You need help carrying that?" I almost said no. But I didn't. "Sure," I replied. At the checkout, I paid. He didn't offer. It wasn't a gesture of chivalry, it was respect for distance. I appreciated that. Outside, the sun hit my face harder than before, and I squinted as we walked to the car. He placed the bags in the back seat without comment. I leaned against the open door, trying to find a smile that wasn't too warm or too cold. He looked up at me, and for the first time in days, neither of us pretended we hadn't been thinking about what happened. And then, without a word, he stepped closer. It wasn't sudden, not rushed. Just a single movement forward, and we kissed. There was no build-up. No dramatic swell of violins in my head. Just the quiet closeness of two people who had crossed something invisible. The kiss was brief. Soft. Like a door swinging open just enough to show the darkness inside. When it ended, I exhaled. He stepped back. We didn't say anything. I got into the car. Closed the door. Watched him walk away in the side mirror. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. But I felt the shift again, the kind that comes not with thunder but with silence. Back home, I unpacked the groceries like nothing had happened. Tea in the pantry. Fruit in the fridge. Eggs on the second shelf. I moved through each action with deliberate care, almost afraid that if I paused, I'd feel too much. The front door opened 20 minutes later. My husband. Home earlier than usual. He walked in, placed his keys on the counter, and gave me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. "Good day," he asked. "Same as always," I said. He didn't notice the flush in my cheeks. Or maybe he did, and didn't care enough to ask. He opened the fridge, poured himself a glass of water, and disappeared into the den. I stared at the spot where he had stood and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he didn't ask. Sadness that he didn't ask. Later that evening, I stood in front of the mirror. Brushed my hair slower than usual. Wiped away the hint of mascara under my eyes. My reflection looked different. Not younger. Not prettier. Just more awake. Like something inside me had opened a door and was watching the world with new eyes. I didn't know what the kiss meant. I didn't know what I wanted it to mean. But I knew that a part of me, a part one thought had long since gone dormant, was awake now, restless and alert, and it wasn't going back to sleep. I climbed into bed that night beside my husband. He didn't speak. Turned away, already breathing deep, already gone into whatever world he retreated to each night. I watched the ceiling. Listened to the hum of the heater. And tried not to think about how soft his lips had felt. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet blur. I went through the motions of my life, folded laundry, watered the plants, answered emails, but everything felt distant, like I was playing a role in someone else's routine. The kiss hadn't been long, hadn't been heated or frantic. But it had happened. That fact lingered like a bruise beneath the skin, invisible but sore to the touch. I didn't hear from him again that week, and I didn't reach out either. There was something unspoken between us now, a silent agreement that neither of us knew how to break. I tried to carry on like nothing had shifted, but each moment felt as though it had a shadow attached to it. The way my husband absent-mindedly patted my shoulder before leaving for work. The way my phone stayed silent, and I checked it anyway. The way I stared at my reflection a second too long each night, searching for something I couldn't name. Then, late one afternoon, I received a text from him. "Do you still need help with that cabinet in the guest room?" I'm nearby. My pulse quickened. I read the message 3 times before replying. Sure, if you have time. He arrived less than an hour later, a toolbox in hand, his face neutral but unreadable. I offered him tea. He declined politely. We walked upstairs without speaking much. The guest room was dim, quiet, slightly chilly. I pulled the curtain aside to let in more light. He set the box down and began working, unscrewing old hinges, removing the warped panel I hadn't been able to fix. I stood a few feet away, arms crossed, unsure of what to do with myself. I wasn't watching him. Not really. But I was aware of every move he made, the way his shoulders shifted with each motion, the quiet confidence in his hands. When he stood to reach the top shelf, he asked me to hold the ladder steady. I stepped forward, bracing it, and his foot brushed mine. Not enough to call attention to. Not enough to be intentional. But enough to make my breath catch. We didn't speak for the next few minutes. I tried not to let my eyes drift toward his hands, his arms, the exposed bit of skin above his collar. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at me, wiping his hands on a rag. Should be good now. I nodded. Thank you. I kept putting it off. No problem, he said, then paused. It's nice to be helpful sometimes. I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't trust myself to. He bent to gather his tools, and I stood frozen in place, not out of fear, but confusion. I wanted to say something, to ask what he thought about the last time we saw each other, if it had stayed with him like it had with me. But I didn't. As he turned to leave the room, I heard myself say, "Stay for dinner. If you want." He hesitated, just a second. Then, okay. We moved around the kitchen like 2 people rehearsing a dance they hadn't performed in years. I chopped vegetables. He poured water into a pot. Our elbows brushed. He handed me a spoon. There was no music, no special lighting, just the mundane clatter of domestic life, but everything buzzed with a strange tension. The kitchen was warmer than usual. Or maybe I was imagining it. I kept reaching up to brush stray hair from my neck, kept pulling at the sleeve of my blouse. He noticed, I think. But he didn't say anything. At the table, we ate mostly in silence. The occasional clink of a fork. A soft murmur of approval when he complimented the food. But no real conversation. It felt safer that way. Too much talking, and one of us might name what was happening. Might ruin it with honesty. Afterward, I stood at the sink washing dishes, and he stepped beside me with a towel. I handed him a plate without looking. This feels, he started, then stopped. I waited, unsure if I wanted to hear the end of that sentence. Normal, he said quietly. It feels like something I missed without knowing I missed it. I dried my hands. The weight of his words pressed against me. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel, guilt, maybe. Longing, definitely. But more than anything, I felt awake. I hadn't realized how numb I'd become until now. He stayed another hour, talking about nothing, books, weather, memories from when he was younger. I listened more than I spoke. Watched him more than I should have. When he stood to leave, I walked him to the door. We didn't touch. We didn't say anything that crossed the line. But I lingered in the doorway long after he left, watching the street, my breath fogging against the glass. My husband wasn't due home for another hour. I didn't move. I just stood there, suspended between 2 lives. That night, when I climbed into bed, I laid awake long after the lights were off. My husband's steady breathing filled the room. I listened to it, as I had for years, and tried to imagine a version of my life where that sound still comforted me. It didn't. Not the way it used to. And maybe that was the most dangerous realization of all. There was something dangerously comforting about how easily it all blended into the ordinary. I found myself falling into a rhythm that shouldn't have existed, texts exchanged under the guise of casual updates, brief visits to help around the house, quiet dinners that no one else knew about. There was never a plan. No deliberate meetings in secret places, no whispered declarations. Just small, seemingly harmless choices stacking up like bricks around me. And each time I told myself it didn't mean anything, the silence after felt a little heavier. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have. Not out of vanity, though I had started paying more attention to my appearance, but because I couldn't quite recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked charged. Like someone waiting for something she wouldn't admit she wanted. I traced the line of my collarbone with my fingertips and wondered when I'd started doing that again. My husband hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had, and chose not to ask. That afternoon, I sent a message. Just a few words. I have some boxes in the garage that need moving. If you're free. The response came almost immediately. Be there around 4. It was a test, though I didn't know what I was testing. Myself? Him? The limits of what could still be called innocent? I wore jeans and a thin knit top that clung a little closer than necessary. Nothing overt. But intentional. And that was the part one couldn't stop thinking about, the intention. The tiny ways I was shaping this, even when pretending I wasn't. When he arrived, he didn't comment on how I looked. Just smiled, set his keys down, and followed me to the garage. We moved in near silence, lifting dusty boxes and reorganizing the clutter that had built up over the years. The physical work was grounding, almost like a distraction, until his hand brushed mine as we reached for the same box. We both paused. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No long stare, no skipped breath. Just two adults surrounded by silence, touching hands for half a second too long. He cleared his throat. These must have been here forever. I nodded. I kept meaning to go through them, but it's easier to ignore them, he said, finishing my sentence in a way that made something twist inside me. We finished quickly. Too quickly. The task had been a pretext, and now that it was done, I felt the weight of that truth settle into the space between us. I walked him to the kitchen, offered water. He accepted. We stood leaning on opposite counters, not speaking. I can stay a bit if you want, he said. It was simple, unforced. I looked down at the glass in my hands. You don't have anywhere else to be? He shook his head. Not today. So we sat. Talked. Nothing heavy. Just stories, memories, fragments of life we hadn't shared before. The kinds of things you say when you don't know what else to say but don't want to leave. At one point, he reached across the table and touched the back of my hand. I didn't pull away. It felt natural. That scared me more than anything. When he left an hour later, I watched him from the doorway again. But this time, he turned before stepping off the porch. You okay? He asked. I hesitated. I don't know. He nodded, like he understood. Maybe he did. After he left, I wandered through the house aimlessly. I ended up in the guest room, where we'd repaired the cabinet. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, thinking about how easily something innocent could grow into something you couldn't explain. Later that night, my husband brought home takeout. We ate in the living room, the TV playing something neither of us was watching. He told me about an issue at work, a meeting that had gone longer than expected. I nodded, responded in the right places. But I wasn't really there. It wasn't that I was comparing them. That would have been easier to justify. It was more that I'd stopped feeling visible to him. Like I was part of the background, reliable and expected. He didn't touch my arm when passing the salt. Didn't notice the way I sat curled up on the couch. Didn't ask about the garage. Maybe he thought we were fine. Maybe I'd told him that enough times, he believed it. I found myself wondering if I would have noticed it, had someone else not stepped into the silence and filled it so gently. That night, as I folded towels in the laundry room, I thought about lines. The ones we draw in our minds. The ones we claim we'll never cross. And how easily they blur when no one's watching. I had told myself we were just talking. Just reconnecting. Just remembering the comfort of being known. But deep down, I knew. I knew that the moment wasn't far. That point where something would shift again, undeniably. Where pretending wouldn't be enough anymore. I didn't know if I was ready for that. But I also didn't know how to stop it. There was a gathering that evening, something routine, something social. My husband's colleagues and a few of their spouses. The kind of night that once used to excite me in the early years, back when I still thought I could impress him with the way I wore my hair or the color of my blouse. Now, it was just another obligation. I stood in front of the closet longer than I should have, fingers brushing past dresses I hadn't worn in years, fabric that used to feel like a second skin but now hung like costumes from a different life. I chose something simple. Dark, fitted, safe. As I applied lipstick in front of the mirror, I tried not to look at my own eyes. It had been days since I last saw him, not my husband, but the one who made me feel like I existed in my own story again. The silence between us had returned, but this time it felt intentional. Like we both sensed something on the horizon and didn't know how to meet it. At the event, I played the role I knew so well. Smiling at the right moments, offering polite laughter, nodding through small talk about renovations and retirement plans. My husband stood beside me, hand occasionally brushing the small of my back, a gesture of possession more than affection. To anyone watching, we looked like any couple who had weathered the years with quiet grace. But I felt it in the way his hand didn't linger. In the way he didn't notice when I stopped listening. He stepped away at one point to speak with a colleague, and I found myself alone by the buffet. That's when I saw him. Across the room, in conversation with someone I didn't recognize. I hadn't expected him to be there. It wasn't his usual crowd. But there he was, calm, composed, as though nothing lived beneath the surface of that steady expression. Our eyes met. Just briefly. There was no reaction. No acknowledgement. Not even a flicker. And somehow, that hurt more than if he'd turned away. I poured a drink I didn't want and pretended to study the label on a bottle of wine, giving myself permission not to return to my husband's side right away. My fingers trembled slightly as I gripped the stem of the glass. I told myself it was the lighting. The noise. The heat in the room. But it wasn't. It was the ache of being made invisible again, just when I'd started to believe I was still visible to someone. Later, as we left the event, my husband commented on how well the evening had gone. He praised the food, the turnout, the generosity of the hosts. He asked if I enjoyed myself. I lied. Back home, I showered alone. The water was too hot, the room too steamy. I leaned my forehead against the cool tile and exhaled slowly. I wasn't crying. Not exactly. But there was a hollow sort of pressure behind my eyes, the kind that builds when you've been holding too many things for too long and your arms finally start to give out. When I stepped into the bedroom, he was already in bed. Reading. Glasses sliding slightly down his nose, the way they always did. I slipped beneath the covers in silence, still damp at the edges, still carrying steam in my hair. He looked over at me. "You were quiet tonight," he said. Just tired, I answered, without turning to face him. He reached across the mattress and placed a hand on my waist. It was meant to be affectionate, maybe even reassuring. But it landed like a placeholder. Like something meant to remind me we were still tethered, even if the thread had grown thin. That night, I dreamt I was in a room full of mirrors, and each one reflected a different version of myself. In none of them did I look happy. I woke before sunrise, heart racing, sheets twisted around my legs. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between his breaths. I tried to remember the last time those sounds comforted me. I couldn't. The next morning passed in silence. He left early for work, a quick kiss on the forehead, an offhand promise to call later. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I stood in the hallway, barefoot, holding my coffee like an anchor. And then my phone vibrated. It was him. Just one sentence. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen, not sure what it meant to say yes. I typed a reply. "Come by later. Just for a little while." I cleaned the living room without meaning to, fluffing pillows, folding throws, wiping counters that didn't need wiping. I wasn't preparing for anything. At least, that's what I told myself. But there was a kind of electricity humming under my skin that I hadn't felt in years. He arrived just before noon. The knock was soft. Cautious. When I opened the door, he stood there like someone not sure if he should be there. No smile. No confidence. Just uncertainty. We didn't speak at first. I stepped aside, let him in. He walked to the window, stared out at nothing in particular. "I wasn't expecting to see you last night," I said finally. "Me neither," he replied. "I didn't know you'd be there. You didn't even look at me." "I did. Just not in a way anyone else would notice." The silence between us thickened. Not angry. Not cold. Just full of all the things we couldn't say directly. I sat down. He followed, but left space between us. "I don't know where this is going," I said. "I don't even know if I want to know." He looked at me. "Then why did you ask me to come?" The question hit harder than it should have. I didn't answer right away. I watched the light through the curtains flicker across the floor. Finally, I said, "Because it felt worse not knowing what you'd say than hearing something I didn't want to." He nodded. We sat there, not touching, not even looking at each other most of the time. And yet, I felt closer to him in that stillness than I had to my husband in weeks. Maybe months. He stood after a while. Said he should go. I didn't stop him. But as he walked to the door, I followed. And there, in the soft light of early afternoon, we kissed. No words. No justification. Just the truth of it. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the same place, eyes fixed on the floor. There was no going back now. I didn't know what came next. But the line had been crossed. Quietly. Permanently. The air inside the house felt heavier after he left. Not oppressive, not quite, but thick with something unspoken, something irreversible. I stood in the foyer for a long time, listening to the sound of nothing at all. The ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary sounds. Familiar sounds. But they didn't comfort me the way they used to. Everything now seemed like it belonged to someone else's life, one I had quietly stepped out of without announcing my departure. I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilt in the way I expected to. There was no collapse, no dramatic shame. Just a strange stillness, a weight in my chest that wasn't heavy enough to break me, but deep enough to press against my breathing. I spent the rest of the afternoon wandering from room to room, straightening things that didn't need to be straightened, wiping already clean countertops. I kept the television off. I didn't want voices. I didn't want distraction. I wanted silence, the kind that let me hear my own thoughts, even if I wasn't sure I liked what they were telling me. When my husband returned home that evening, he carried the scent of the outside world with him, the sharpness of car exhaust, the faint echo of his office cologne. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day. I answered evenly, instinctively. He didn't notice anything different. Or if he did, he didn't say so. We ate dinner at the table like always. He talked about a new client. I listened. I nodded. I laughed at the right moment, even though I wasn't really there. After dinner, he went into the den to read. I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing dishes I didn't need to rinse, running water long after everything was clean. I didn't want to be in the same room. I didn't want to pretend. But I wasn't ready to explain either. That night, I lay in bed with my back to him, staring out the window at the moonlight spilling over the edge of the curtain. My body was still. My thoughts were loud. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked into the living room and found a message waiting on my phone. It was from him. Just a few words. I'm driving to the lake house this weekend. The pipes need checking. I could use an extra set of hands. I stared at the message. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I made coffee. I fed the plants. I watched the steam rise from the cup and disappear. I told myself it wasn't an invitation. Not really. But we both knew it was. Not to anything explicit. Just to more. To whatever it was we were already circling. I typed slowly. Okay. Just for the day. He didn't reply, but I knew he would come. When Saturday arrived, I told my husband I was helping organize boxes from the attic, an excuse vague enough to be unquestioned, domestic enough to be believed. He nodded, kissed the top of my head, and returned to his weekend projects without hesitation. The drive to the lake house was quiet. I didn't play music. I didn't want lyrics trying to make meaning of anything. I needed the sound of the road, the rhythm of the tires, the stretch of the highway leading me towards something I couldn't fully name. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, he was already there, unloading tools from his car. He looked up as I stepped out, gave a slight nod, not a smile, not a greeting, just acknowledgement. We didn't hug. We didn't touch. But something in the way he looked at me told me everything I needed to know. He felt it too, that tension, that pull, that edge of something impossible to step back from. The house smelled of cedar and dust. He opened windows to let in the breeze. We worked together, checking pipes, moving boxes, cleaning surfaces dulled by time. The familiarity of it all made it easier to ignore what was building between us. We spoke only when necessary, instructions, questions, observations about the house, all of it simple, controlled. But the spaces between those words were louder than anything spoken. At some point, I stepped outside to breathe. The lake shimmered in the afternoon sun. I leaned against the railing of the porch, watching the light dance on the water, trying to calm the chaos inside my chest. I heard the screen door open behind me, but I didn't turn. He stood next to me in silence. The wind moved my hair across my cheek. I brushed it back and kept my eyes on the lake. It's peaceful out here, I said. He nodded. Yeah. Another pause. Then, why did you really come? I didn't answer immediately. I kept watching the water, the way it moved without resistance. I wanted to say I didn't know. But that would have been a lie. Because I didn't want to feel invisible today, I said quietly. He turned toward me, but I didn't meet his gaze. I couldn't. You're not invisible, he said. I let the words settle. They weren't a promise. Not a declaration. Just a truth. One I had refused to admit I needed to hear. We went back inside shortly after. We cleaned up. Closed windows. Turned off lights. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the floors. When it came time to leave, we stood at our cars like people who didn't know how to say goodbye. Drive safe, he said. You too. I opened my car door, then hesitated. He waited. I stepped closer. And before I could talk myself out of it, we spent the night together. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It just was. That night, nothing exploded. No words were spoken that couldn't be taken back. But something settled. Something undeniable. A line crossed not in haste or guilt, but in quiet, conscious choice. When I woke the next morning, the lake was still. The house was quiet. He was gone. But the weight of what had happened wasn't. It stayed with me, not as regret, but as consequence. And as I drove back to the life I had built, I knew that nothing would ever be exactly the same. The return home was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't invite peace, but rather hums with the knowledge that something has shifted. I turned off the ignition and sat in the car longer than necessary, staring at the outline of our house against the morning light. The shutters were closed, as they always were on Sundays. The porch light still burned faintly from the night before. It was a familiar scene, but I felt like an intruder stepping into someone else's life. I walked inside slowly, careful not to let the door slam. The scent of home greeted me, laundry detergent, brewed coffee, the faint trace of my husband's aftershave. I paused in the hallway, listening. The house was still asleep. I kicked off my shoes, left my bag by the stairs, and climbed up quietly, already rehearsing the explanation I wasn't sure I'd need. In the bedroom, he lay under the covers, turned away from the door. I watched him for a moment. His breathing was deep, steady. Peaceful. I slipped into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the water run hot enough to sting. I scrubbed my skin harder than usual. Not to erase anything, not out of guilt. It wasn't about cleansing. It was about grounding myself in a body that felt like it had betrayed two lives at once. After I dressed, I stood in front of the mirror and pulled my hair back. My face looked the same. No one would know. No one would ask. And still, I lingered, waiting for something, some feeling, some verdict, but none came. Just the quiet realization that I had crossed into a version of myself I could no longer walk away from. Downstairs, my husband greeted me in his robe, sipping coffee. "You're up early," he said, smiling faintly. I returned it. I couldn't sleep much. He nodded toward the living room. "Come sit with me." I was just about to turn on the news. I sat. Folded my hands. Listened to the low drone of a newscaster's voice as my husband leaned back, completely at ease. I tried to listen. I tried to care. But all I could think about was how strange it felt to be surrounded by familiarity that no longer fit. Later that day, we worked together in the garden. He talked about planting new shrubs in the fall. I nodded in the right places. Helped him carry bags of soil, trimmed dead branches. It felt like a performance we both knew by heart but hadn't rehearsed in a long time. At times, I caught myself watching him. Not with affection, exactly. With curiosity. Wondering if he could tell that something in me had changed, or if he simply preferred not to look too closely. That night, I received a message. "Are you okay?" It was him. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the screen for a full minute, rereading the 3 words as if they held a different meaning each time. Finally, I typed, "I don't know." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The next morning, I woke early again. I sat by the window with my coffee wrapped in a blanket, watching the street come to life. Runners. Dog walkers. A child on a scooter wobbling down the sidewalk. The world kept moving, indifferent to the changes that felt so monumental to me. By midweek, I found myself back in the rhythm of routine: groceries, laundry, errands. But everything had a muted edge. Even the colors outside seemed dimmer, as though my perception had adjusted to a quieter palette. I didn't reach out to him, and he didn't reach out to me. But his absence felt different now. Like the space he left behind had a shape and weight of its own. One afternoon, while reorganizing the hall closet, I found an old photo of us, my husband and me, taken on a beach trip years ago. We were laughing, sunburned, caught mid-motion by someone else's camera. I studied my face in the picture, tried to remember what it felt like to be her. To be light enough to laugh without wondering what was missing. I placed the photo back in the box without looking at it again. That evening, I stood in the kitchen, stirring pasta, when my husband walked in. "You've been quiet lately," he said. I looked up, met his gaze. "Have I?" He studied me for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to pursue it further. But then he just said, "Work's been stressful." "I guess I haven't been around much either." I nodded. "I know." He came over, kissed my forehead. I didn't flinch. But I didn't lean into it either. After dinner, we watched a movie together. He fell asleep halfway through, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. I turned the volume down and stared at the screen, not seeing the images. My thoughts were louder than the soundtrack. When the credits rolled, I turned off the TV and sat there in the dim light. My husband snored gently beside me, unaware of the war taking place just inches away. I wondered if I would ever tell him. What would be the point? Would it fix anything? Would it only destroy what was still standing? I stood slowly, turned off the last lamp, and walked upstairs. That night, I didn't dream. I didn't toss or turn. I just lay awake, eyes open, listening to the rain begin to tap against the windows. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew the real storm was still coming. The following days settled into an eerie kind of normal. My routines became sharper, almost obsessively so. The laundry was folded before it cooled, every meal prepped like a performance, every surface wiped twice. I moved through the house like someone trying to prove nothing had changed, even as everything beneath the surface twisted tighter with each breath. My husband didn't notice. Or he did and chose not to ask. He was preoccupied, buried in work, with meetings and spreadsheets and the comfort of predictable stress. We had dinner together, watched television. Sometimes we even talked about weekend plans. It all felt strangely scripted, like actors reciting lines from a play we'd forgotten we were in. But I knew better. There was a moment that stuck with me, small, insignificant on the surface. I was watering the plants on the back porch when I saw a figure across the street, near the mailbox. Not him. Just a neighbor retrieving envelopes. But for a second, my chest tightened. I had expected someone else. I had hoped. That realization clung to me all day. I told myself I wouldn't reach out. That we had gone far enough. That lines were not meant to be blurred indefinitely. But silence has its own gravity, and it was pulling me in. He texted 2 days later. "Can I see you? Just for a walk. Somewhere quiet." I stared at the screen, debating. Then typed back. "Yes. But not near the house." We met at a small park 2 towns over, one with a walking trail that curved around a man-made pond and offered just enough privacy without drawing suspicion. I arrived first. I parked at the far end of the lot and sat with the engine off, watching the path, the trees, the water, anything to keep myself grounded. When he appeared, he didn't smile. He just nodded, hands in his pockets, posture uncertain. We walked side by side, not speaking at first. The gravel crunched beneath our shoes, and the occasional bird call cut through the stillness. I didn't know if I should ask, he finally said. I didn't know if I should say yes. We kept walking. The air was cool, the kind that makes your hands cold but not your heart. I looked at him and wondered how we got here, not the day or the kiss or the night at the lake, but the thousand small steps before all that. The ones that felt harmless, forgettable, routine. I keep thinking about what this means, he said, his voice lower now. About what we're doing. So do I. And? I paused. It doesn't feel like something I can explain. It just feels real. He looked at me, but I didn't meet his gaze. I couldn't. I don't want to ruin anything, he said after a while. Maybe it's already ruined, I replied, not bitterly, just honestly. He didn't argue. He didn't try to console. He just kept walking. We circled the lake once, then again. When we finally stopped, we stood near the water's edge, watching the reflection of the trees ripple with the breeze. Do you regret it? He asked. I thought about it. No. But I regret what it says about my life. That seemed to hit harder than either of us expected. We didn't hug. We didn't touch. We just stood there until the silence became too dense, too full of things that could only be broken by goodbye. He left first. I stayed behind, watching his figure grow smaller along the path. Then I sat on a bench and let the stillness wrap around me. When I returned home, I found my husband in the garage, tinkering with something under the hood of his car. He looked up and smiled like everything was normal. Get everything done? Yeah. Just needed some air. He wiped his hands on a towel. You've seemed distracted lately. I hesitated. Maybe I've just been thinking too much. He nodded. That happens. No follow-up. No pressing. Just that. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I wondered what kind of marriage survives not by truth, but by the avoidance of it. What kind of love stays intact simply because no one dares to look it in the eye. In the darkness, I could feel the weight of all I hadn't said. And I realized, with a kind of hollow acceptance, that the silence between us wasn't an accident. It was a choice. We had both made it. Long before anything happened. Long before the kiss, the lake house, the walk in the park. The next morning, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a photo. Not explicit. Just the back porch. Me. Leaning against the railing, phone in hand. Taken from a distance. No message. No threat. But the message was clear. Someone had seen me. I stood there, frozen, the photo trembling in my fingers. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind a car or a tree. But the street was empty. Calm. Deceptively ordinary. I slid the photo back into the envelope and tucked it into a drawer beneath the cutlery, beneath the silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Because now, it wasn't just about guilt or desire. It was about being seen by the wrong eyes. And I had no idea what would happen next. I checked the locks on the doors twice that night. Not because I was afraid of someone breaking in, but because the stillness inside the house felt too exposed. The photograph haunted me, not in the sense of danger, not yet, but in what it implied. I wasn't just watched. I was seen. And the difference sat cold in my stomach as I stood in the dark kitchen, staring at the drawer where I'd hidden the envelope. I didn't tell him. Not my husband. Not him either. I told no one. The next day unfolded in slow motion. I moved through my morning like someone wearing a version of herself. Everything felt like mimicry, brushing my hair, pouring coffee, responding to texts. Even the air seemed heavier, as if it had absorbed the tension and now pressed against my skin with every step I took. At the grocery store, I caught myself scanning the aisles, as though expecting to see someone watching. No one was. And that made it worse. I began replaying every recent moment. The walk in the park. The porch. The lake house. Had someone followed me? Or had it been chance? Someone walking a dog, noticing something unusual? Or was it someone who knew? The idea of that lingered. I didn't bring it up at dinner. My husband sat across from me, talking about a renovation project at work. His words washed over me, unanchored, distant. I nodded when needed, smiled when expected. But my mind kept returning to the photo. I left the table early, claiming a headache. He offered aspirin. I declined. That night, I pulled the photo back out. Turned it over. No handwriting. No message. Just the image of me leaning on the porch rail, phone in hand, expression unreadable. It wasn't damning. Not really. But the angle, the context, it said too much. Or maybe just enough. I placed it back in the envelope and hid it in a different place. Not the drawer. A book I hadn't touched in years, shelved high in the guest room. I slid it between the pages, closed the cover gently, and stood there for a while, heart thudding louder than reason. In the following days, I tried to act as though everything was normal. But inside, I had begun retreating from my own life, not in panic, but in quiet self-preservation. I became more careful with my phone. More reserved with my words. I watched the windows without appearing to. I left rooms without explanation. I didn't reach out to him. And he didn't either. But I knew he felt it. The shift. The drop in energy. The sense of something tightening around us, unseen but undeniable. Then, one morning, as I stood folding laundry in the sunlit room downstairs, he called. Not a text. Not a message. A call. I hesitated before answering, heart suddenly too loud. I pressed the phone to my ear, said nothing at first. His voice was low. I think someone knows. My breath stopped. There was silence. Then I said, I got a photo. I thought maybe it was just me, he said. That I was overthinking. What did you get? Nothing yet. Just looks. Someone asked a question that felt too pointed. A comment that didn't sound casual. I closed my eyes. What do we do? I asked. I don't know. That was the truth. Neither of us did. We hung up soon after. There were no promises. No plans. Just that quiet understanding that something external had entered our space, and it wouldn't leave easily. That afternoon, my husband suggested a weekend away. Just the two of us. The beach. The place we used to go before everything slowed down. I agreed. I didn't want to go. But I agreed. As we packed, I found myself watching him more carefully. The way he folded shirts. The way he checked the weather. He looked content. Maybe even excited. I wondered what version of me he saw when he looked across the room. I wondered if he noticed the silence between us had become more than fatigue, that it was structure now. Weight. Shape. The drive was long and quiet. He talked. I nodded. I leaned my head against the window and let the road slip by in streaks of color. When we arrived, the cottage was the same. Wooden floors, sea salt in the air, everything unchanged. And yet, I felt like a stranger there. He suggested a walk on the beach before dinner. I followed. We walked along the shoreline, shoes in hand, sand cold under our feet. He talked about us. About the early days. About what he missed. About how he wanted to find it again. I listened. I tried to listen. And I realized something. He didn't know. Not in the real way. He sensed the distance. He sensed the shift. But not the root. And maybe that was worse. Because it meant he still believed there was a version of us to salvage, without knowing how far we'd drifted from it. Later that night, I sat outside while he slept. Wrapped in a blanket, watching the ocean move in the moonlight. The wind pulled at my hair. My phone sat in my lap. I didn't message him. But I thought about it. I thought about telling him everything. Or nothing. I thought about whether I could walk away from it now, from him, from what happened, from the version of myself that had been unraveling in slow, deliberate threads. And I knew, deep down, that the answer wouldn't come easily. Because now, it wasn't just about guilt or desire. Now, someone else knew. And that changed everything. There is a particular quiet that comes at the end of things. I felt it settling around me that weekend, not like a blanket, but more like a shroud, light enough to ignore if I wanted to, but always there when I was still. The ocean was relentless, waves tumbling over each other with a kind of indifference that made everything human seem small. I sat on the porch of the cottage long after my husband had gone to bed, feeling the salt on my lips, my skin chilled from the wind. Inside, our bags lay half unpacked. He had filled the small fridge with fruit and yogurt, coffee for the mornings. There was a sense of ritual to it all, like we were two people pretending to be married in a play, going through the lines, blocking the scenes, but never quite finding the heart that used to drive it. The day passed slowly. We took long walks, mostly in silence. He tried to reach me, in his way. Asked if I wanted to try the old seafood restaurant, if I remembered how we used to drive out for pie at midnight. He smiled, told stories from years ago. I smiled back. I said the right words. But inside, it felt as if something vital had been replaced with a pale imitation, an echo of warmth, but not the real thing. That evening, as we sat at the little table by the window, I saw him watching me. There was concern in his eyes, the kind that had grown more common lately. He poured us both a glass of wine. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said softly. I set my glass down, tracing the rim with my finger. "I suppose I have." He waited, patient, giving me space to fill the silence. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say that would make sense, that wouldn't shatter the fragile truce we were living inside. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. I felt his fingers, warm, familiar, but foreign all at once. "I miss you," he said. The words hit me with an ache I hadn't anticipated. I almost envied his hope, his belief that what was lost could be found again, if only we reached for it together. But I was too far away. Or perhaps, I had finally found myself in the space I'd been drifting toward all along. Later that night, I walked along the shore alone. The sky was dark, the water silvered by the moon, cold around my ankles. I let the waves pull at my feet, burying them deeper with each retreat. I wanted to feel something pure, pain, clarity, peace, but all I felt was the pull of consequences, the weight of choices that could never be unmade. When we returned home, nothing had changed. The routines resumed. He went back to work. I went back to pretending. But the envelope in the book haunted me. Some nights I would climb quietly from bed and retrieve it, holding the photograph in my hands, searching for meaning in the way the light fell across my face, the way my body curved against the porch railing, the shadow at my feet. Sometimes, I thought I saw a figure behind me. Sometimes, I thought I saw nothing at all. He texted less. Eventually, not at all. There was no confrontation, no apology. Just a fading. A withdrawal as gradual as the tide, leaving behind traces only I could see. I tried to focus on what was left. The house, the dinners, the anniversaries that came and went. I tried to rebuild what had cracked between us, offering small gestures of affection, touches on the shoulder, a cup of tea beside his computer, an invitation to walk together at dusk. Sometimes, he responded. Sometimes, he didn't. I stopped expecting answers. One afternoon, while clearing out old files, I found a letter I'd written to myself years before. It was filled with hopes for the future, plans for travel, for learning to paint, for loving more bravely. I read it through twice, then placed it in a drawer beside the photo, neither able to throw it away nor ready to revisit it fully. The ache never left completely. But over time, it dulled, became background noise, something I could live with. The secret stayed mine. No one ever confronted me. No one ever named what they saw. Perhaps that was my punishment. Or my mercy. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I'd remember the version of myself that began all this, a woman looking for proof that she could still be seen, still be wanted, still be real. I felt compassion for her, even as I grieved what she had lost. There are things we do to survive. There are things we do because we are afraid not to. I don't know what my story means, in the end. Maybe nothing more than the sum of its parts. Maybe everything. But I know I will never forget the feeling of his hand on my back that first night in the trailer, the moment I let silence stretch too long, the second I crossed a line I could never uncross. And I know that, for better or worse, I am not the same woman who stood on that porch, believing she could remain unseen. I live with that. Quietly, every day. All 10 parts are complete. If you request to continue, I will not proceed, as the story is finished.